The Crathian Commonwealth had not survived 4,000 years by being careless. Every treaty it had signed, every border it had drawn, every war it had won or avoided, all of it, rested on a single principle that Director Harlan had repeated so many times it had become less a philosophy and more a reflex. Know your counterpart before they know you. Study them. Map their weaknesses. Understand what they want before they understand what you're offering. Then walk into the room already holding the outcome. Ambassador Lyra Voss had lived by that principle for 40 years. She was standing at the wide observation window of the Commonwealth Diplomatic Headquarters on Krathia Prime when Harlan summoned her. The city stretched below in the amber light of late afternoon towers of pale stone, rising from the valley floor like fingers reaching upward, the kind of view that reminded you that civilization was not an accident. It was a construction. Deliberate, patient, costly. She was 63 years old. She had negotiated 23 treaties. She had walked into rooms where the tension was so thick you could feel it pressing against your chest, rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment could mean war, and she had walked out of every single one of them with what the Commonwealth needed. She had never lost. She intended to keep it that way. Harlan was waiting in the council chamber, seated at the head of the long table, with the holographic star map already projected above its surface. 17 systems burned in soft blue light, the constellation of Commonwealth territory filling the center of the display. Around that cluster of blue, the neighboring powers glowed in various shades, the Velhari Dominion to the north, the Syndicate worlds to the east, and at the far edge of the map, occupying a modest corner of the Sector 5 small systems, rendered in a pale, almost hesitant white, humanity. She had read the briefings 3 times before the meeting. She had read them because that was who she was, not because she expected to find anything surprising. There was very little to read. That was in itself the most interesting thing about them. Humanity had appeared in the sector approximately 6 years ago by Commonwealth reckoning. Not appeared in the dramatic sense, no sudden fleet, no declaration, no demand for recognition. They had simply been there one day, quiet and contained within their small cluster of systems, and the Commonwealth's deep-range sensors had noticed them the way you might notice a light left on in a house you thought was empty. They had claimed their territory with simple precision, coordinates broadcast on open frequencies. No fanfare, just mathematical fact, these systems are ours. They had established no embassies. They had sent no trade vessels beyond their borders. They had responded to preliminary Commonwealth contact probes with polite acknowledgement and nothing more. No information about their government structure, their military capability, their population, their technology. Just acknowledgement. We have received your communication. Thank you, that was all. For 6 years, that was all. The intelligence analysts had filled the void with projections. 5 systems suggested a modest population, perhaps 12 billion at generous estimate. Their energy emissions indicated technology roughly comparable to early Commonwealth expansion-era capability, perhaps 2 centuries behind current standard. Their silence could be interpreted as insularity, as caution, as the natural hesitation of a younger civilization, uncertain of its place in a larger universe. The briefings were careful not to call them weak. They were even more careful not to call them strong. What they were in every honest assessment was unknown. Harlan had his hands flat on the table when Lyra walked in. That was a tell she had learned to read in him years ago. Flat hands meant he had already made up his mind and was simply waiting for the conversation to confirm it. The expansionist coalition, he told her, had been pushing for a more assertive posture in the outer sector for the better part of a year. Resources in unclaimed space adjacent to human territory. Strategic positioning. The usual arguments. But the council had decided for now, for as long as it remained viable, that contact and treaty were preferable to pressure. Lyra would lead the mission. She looked at the 5 pale systems on the map for a long moment. She had one question: had humanity ever indicated any preference for how contact should be initiated? Harlan looked at her with the expression of a man who had already considered this and found it unimportant. They hadn't indicated any preference, he said. They hadn't indicated much of anything. She nodded slowly. In her experience, civilizations that said very little were either profoundly uninterested in their neighbors or profoundly prepared for them. She did not say this to Harlan. She simply told him she would need 3 months. He told her she had exactly that. She turned back to the window on her way out, looking at the city below, at the towers and the amber light, at the long evidence of what patience and precision could build. 4,000 years, 17 systems, 23 treaties. She would make it 24. The preparation took 91 days. It was the most thorough diplomatic package Lyra had ever assembled, and she had assembled packages for powers far more formidable than anything humanity appeared to be. She worked with a team of 14 specialists, 17 linguistic frameworks, each mapped and verified against every recoverable sample of human language broadcasting that had reached Commonwealth sensors over 6 years of passive monitoring. Cultural sensitivity analysis drawn from those same broadcasts filtered, weighted, cross-referenced. 3 proposed meeting dates, each spaced months apart to allow for whatever internal processes a cautious new civilization might require. Neutral site suggestions. A framework for territorial discussions that opened generously and built toward a position of quiet Commonwealth advantage through language so carefully constructed that a reader would need to study it 3 times before noticing the tilt. It was in the assessment of the Diplomatic Corps Senior Review Board, the finest opening package they had seen in 20 years. Commander Cale Stroud did not share their enthusiasm. He was the security commander for the mission assigned by the Council at Harlan's insistence, and he had made his position clear in the first briefing and every briefing after. He was not opposed to contact. He was opposed to the assumptions underlying the approach. He was a lean, precise man with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where stillness was a survival skill. And when he spoke about humanity, his voice carried a quality that Lyra had learned to identify in 30 years of working alongside military advisors. It was not fear, it was the calibrated discomfort of a man who had spent his career building threat assessments and was looking at a subject for which he had almost no usable data. 6 years of silence from a civilization that had the capability to reach space and claim territory, he said in their third joint briefing, was not insularity, it was discipline. Lyra told him that discipline was a quality she respected in a negotiating partner. He told her he would feel more comfortable with an expanded weapons complement aboard the Sovereign Bridge. She told him no, the ship would carry standard diplomatic armament, nothing more. Walking into a first contact with visible escalation was not an opening. It was a provocation dressed in formality. He accepted this. He did not agree with it, but he accepted it, and that was the relationship they had settled into over those 91 days, his caution and her confidence, occupying the same space and practiced professional tension. Dr. Corvin Hale, the mission's science director, was a different matter entirely. Where Stroud was measured in his skepticism, Hale was genuinely, almost intellectually restless. He had spent the better part of the preparation period analyzing every available fragment of human emission data, and he had the particular intensity of a scientist who had found a puzzle he couldn't immediately solve. Human technological signatures were consistent with known development patterns, he told Lyra over a working dinner one evening, but with anomalies he couldn't explain cleanly. Energy readings that didn't quite fit the projected capability profile. Patterns that suggested one level of advancement when examined one way and something slightly different when examined another. He was probably reading too hard into noise, he admitted. Probably, Lyra agreed. Neither of them mentioned it again in the formal briefings. Liaison Petrovane, the mission's cultural specialist, was quiet and methodical, the kind of presence that made a room feel steadier. She had worked with the Volhari and the Syndicate worlds, and 3 smaller civilizations Lyra had never personally dealt with, and her assessment of humanity was characteristically careful. Insufficient data to draw firm conclusions, but the patterns in their limited communications suggested a species that valued directness over ceremony. That would make them either straightforward to deal with or very difficult, Lyra said. Petra said she thought exactly the same thing. The Sovereign Bridge departed Krathia Prime on a clear morning, its engines lit against the pale sky, and Lyra stood at the observation window of her private quarters and watched the planet fall away until it was small enough to cover with her hand. She had stood at that window on 23 previous departures. She had always felt the same thing, the sharpening of attention that came with moving from preparation into action, from the map into the territory. The slight tightening in the chest, the clarity. She felt all of that now and something else beneath it. Not quite unease, more like the awareness of standing at the edge of a thing and not being certain of its depth. She turned from the window and went to her desk. She had 17 speeches to finish. The message was transmitted at 800 Commonwealth Standard on the 62nd day of the mission, when the Sovereign Bridge had crossed into the outer sector and humanity's 5 systems were close enough on the long-range sensors to show as distinct points rather than a single cluster. Every member of the senior staff was present on the bridge. The communications officer Drev had spent 3 weeks verifying the translation matrices and was working very hard to look professionally composed. Lyra read the final version one last time before authorizing the send. It was good. It was more than good. It acknowledged humanity's sovereignty with respect that felt genuine because she had constructed it to feel genuine. It established the Commonwealth's position with quiet authority that didn't require stating directly. It proposed a summit with 3 possible dates and 4 possible locations, all neutral, all chosen to demonstrate that the Commonwealth was not presuming control over the conversation's geography. It was exactly the right opening. She authorized the send. Drev transmitted. The bridge was quiet. Long-range communication typically took hours to arrive, and hours more for a response, and a first diplomatic contact properly handled would take days at minimum as the receiving party consulted. Advisors reviewed the material, prepared their reply through whatever internal processes their government required. The acknowledgement light on Drev's console activated 17 seconds later. Lyra was looking at the star chart when she heard the tone. She turned. Drev was staring at his console with the expression of a man who had just seen something he didn't know how to categorize. Verify routing, she said. He verified. The response had originated from within human space. Transmission time was consistent with proximity to their border monitoring stations. There was no error, no delay in the network. The message had arrived, and a reply had been composed and transmitted within 17 seconds of receipt. Display the message, Lyra said. The holographic interface above the central console activated. It was a set of coordinates, standard galactic notation precise to the millimeter, followed by a single timestamp 72 hours from the moment of receipt. Nothing else. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the diplomatic package, no proposed agenda, no counter-suggestions, no pleasantries of any kind. Just numbers. Clean, cold, exact. The bridge was very quiet. Stroud was the first to speak, and his voice had the particular edge of a man choosing his words carefully in order to say something he very much wanted to say less carefully. He called it irregular. Then he called it insulting. 3 months of preparation, he said, and they respond like a courier service issuing delivery instructions. Lyra studied the coordinates. Her mind was moving through possibilities, the way it always moved rapidly, systematically eliminating what didn't hold. A translation error was possible but unlikely. The precision of the notation argued against accident. A cultural idiosyncrasy was more plausible. Some civilizations preferred action over discussion, appointment over negotiation. The Velhari had done something roughly similar in their first contact 40 years ago, though they had at least included a greeting. This had no greeting. It had nothing but a place and a time. She looked at the coordinates. 14 light hours inside human claim space. Not deep enough for a trap in any conventional sense, but far enough inside their territory to constitute a clear statement about who was setting the terms of this meeting. She made her decision. Set course, she told the navigation officer. Stroud began to object. She heard him out because she always heard him out, and then she told him what she had already concluded humanity had responded. Whatever the form of the response, it was a response. A willingness to engage, however unconventional the manner. Declining to attend because the invitation wasn't packaged the way they expected would not be diplomacy. It would be vanity. The Sovereign Bridge adjusted course, its engines pushing it toward a set of numbers floating in space 72 hours away. Lyra returned to her quarters, sat at her desk, and looked at those coordinates for a long time. What kind of civilization answers an offer of dialogue with nothing but a destination? She didn't know. For the first time in a very long career, she genuinely didn't know. The first warning came 6 hours after they crossed into the outer sector. The communications console registered an incoming transmission, automated in format originating from a border monitoring station inside the region humanity called American Reach. Drev flagged it as standard contact protocol and routed it to the bridge speaker. The voice was even precise, neither warm nor cold. Sovereign Bridge, you are entering monitored space. Welcome, your safety is our responsibility while you are here. That was all, no instructions, no conditions, no indication of what being in monitored space actually meant or from where the monitoring was conducted. Stroud interpreted it as a standard territorial acknowledgement, the galactic equivalent of a harbor marker. Hale found it mildly interesting from a linguistic standpoint and made a note in his research log. Petra thought it was politely phrased. Lyra read it twice, then a third time. Your safety is our responsibility. It was a strange construction for a territorial greeting. Not your compliance is our concern. Not you are entering restricted space. Your safety. As though her safety were something that required management. As though there were something in that monitored space from which she might need protecting, and the matter of that protection had already been arranged without being asked for. She filed it away in the part of her mind that collected things she didn't yet understand. The Sovereign Bridge continued its course. 66 hours remained on the timestamp. 48 hours in Hale brought her something that wasn't quite a problem and wasn't quite nothing. He had been running continuous passive sensor analysis of the region they were traveling through, partly out of professional habit and partly because the anomalies from the pre-mission data had been nagging at him. He sat across from her at the small table in her quarters and spread the data across the surface display. The energy readings in this sector were slightly off. Not dramatically, not in any way that would trigger automated alerts. Just slightly the way a room is slightly colder than it should be on a warm day. The kind of difference you notice without being certain why you've noticed it. The readings were consistent with a region of space that was completely empty, which it appeared to be. But there were micro variations in background radiation that didn't fit the expected distribution for empty space. Almost as if the space were, and he apologized for the imprecision, occupied by something doing an extremely thorough job of not looking like it was there. He said he was probably reading too much into noise again. She asked him what his confidence level was on the anomalies being real, rather than sensor artifact. He was quiet for a moment. 62%, he said. Maybe 65. She told him to keep monitoring and to say nothing to Stroud unless the readings changed significantly. He nodded and left. She sat alone for a while after he was gone, looking at nothing in particular, and thought about what it would mean for the space you were traveling through to be occupied by something that had decided not to be seen. The second warning came 22 hours before arrival, and it was different from the first. Jarev routed it to her directly flagged as a directed transmission targeted specifically at the Sovereign Bridge. The same even cadence as the first, but the content had changed. Ambassador Voss, the location you are traveling to will appear empty upon your arrival. This is intentional. Please do not be alarmed. Lyra read the transcript 4 times. She brought it to the senior staff meeting an hour later and watched their faces as they processed it. Stroud's jaw tightened. He called it psychological preparation, deliberate cultivation of uncertainty, a tactic for destabilizing a diplomatic delegation's composure before the actual meeting. He had seen similar approaches from adversarial powers in his years with the security service. Create ambiguity. Make your counterpart feel slightly off balance before the conversation begins. It's working, Petra said quietly. Stroud looked at her. I mean that as an observation, not a criticism, Petra said. Whoever composed these messages is very good at their job. Lyra was looking at the words again. Will appear empty, not might appear empty, not may seem empty to your sensors. Will, the certainty of it, the way it assumed not that they might find the location empty, but that they would and had decided to say so in advance. She thought about what it meant to announce something you were deliberately doing. It was a particular form of courtesy. Here is what we are doing. We want you to know we are doing it before you experience it. We are not hiding the fact of our action, only its mechanism. She thought about what it meant to be confident enough in your mechanism that you could announce its operation in advance without fear that the announcement would allow your counterpart to circumvent it. She did not share these thoughts with Stroud. She told him to keep security protocols at standard level and get some rest before arrival. He told her he didn't require her recommendation on rest. She told him she knew and left. The Sovereign Bridge reached the designated coordinates 4 hours ahead of the timestamp. Lyra was on the bridge when they decelerated to relative zero, the engine cycling down to the low hum of station keeping mode, the viewport showing a view that was, as promised, completely empty. The sensor arrays showed exactly what she expected: background radiation, stellar light from distant sources, the faint drift of interstellar medium. Nothing artificial, no ships, no stations, no energy signatures, no presence. Stroud ran 3 full-spectrum sweeps, all clean. The timestamp had not yet arrived. 4 hours remained. She ordered the ship to hold position and dismissed non-essential crew to rest rotations. The bridge went quiet with the particular quietness of people waiting for something they couldn't predict. Stroud stood at the tactical console and said nothing for a very long time. Then, without looking at her, he said, "They're not coming." She didn't answer. He said, "This is what I was concerned about. We prepared for 3 months. We traveled 72 hours. We walked into their space with a flag of good intentions, and they sent us to stand in an empty field." Lyra was looking at the viewport, at the nothing that the second message had promised would be there. Will appear empty. Not is empty, will appear. She said, "We wait." He turned to look at her. "We have 4 hours remaining on the timestamp," she said. "We wait." He held her gaze for a moment, and then, because he was a professional, and because 40 years had earned her the kind of authority that didn't require argument, he turned back to his console. The bridge waited. Hale was running his sensor analysis with the quiet intensity of a man who had promoted his confidence level to 70% and was watching it climb. He said nothing. The readings from 2 days ago were still registering, still slightly off, still failing to resolve into anything his instruments could identify or name. Petra sat at her station with her hands folded and her eyes on the viewport, and the particular expression of someone who had spent years learning to distinguish between silences that meant nothing and silences that meant everything. The timestamp arrived. Nothing changed. 1 minute passed, 5 minutes, 10. Stroud was about to say something. Lyra could feel it, the way you feel weather changing, that subtle atmospheric shift of a person reaching the end of their patience. And then the communications console activated, and every head on the bridge turned. And the silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of experienced people realizes simultaneously that something is happening that none of them have a framework for. The voice that came from the speaker was human, female, measured and unhurried, carrying beneath its calm surface the quality of something with depth you couldn't see the bottom of. Sovereign Bridge, this is Ambassador Ren Aldis of the Human Diplomatic Corps. Thank you for meeting us at the designated coordinates. Before we proceed, Ambassador Voss, I want to ensure you understand that you are in no danger. What you are about to experience is a demonstration, not a threat. Please maintain your current position and prepare for visual contact. The transmission ended. The bridge held its silence for 3 full seconds. Then Hale's console erupted. His voice, when it came, had lost its academic composure entirely. He was reading numbers that didn't make sense and trying to read them anyway, his words arriving in fragments, quantum fluctuations, hundreds of them, symmetrically distributed, a sphere, centered on the Sovereign Bridge at a radius of 200,000 kilometers, mass distortion signatures of a magnitude that his instruments had no category for: not natural, not possible. Multiple contacts, the sensor operator said. All bearings. And then the void filled. They came from nothing. One moment the viewport showed empty space, the stars hanging in their permanent indifference. And the next moment the stars were replaced by ships. Dozens of them. No more than dozens. 47. They materialized in perfect formation. A sphere of impossible geometry surrounding the Sovereign Bridge with mathematical exactitude, 200,000 kilometers in every direction. Every vessel positioned with a precision that spoke not of rapid deployment, but of long, careful, unhurried preparation. They had been there. They had been there the entire time, and they had chosen this moment and not a second before it to be seen. Lyra stood at the viewport and looked at the nearest ship. She had seen large vessels before. The Commonwealth's own dreadnoughts were formidable, and she had stood on the observation decks of flagships that had made her feel appropriately small. But this was different. The ship in the viewport was not large in the way that large things were large. It was large in the way that mountains were large, in the way that the fact of it seemed to rewrite the available space around it. She heard Hale's voice behind her, hollow with the particular hollowness of a scientist whose instruments have stopped making sense. Approximately 2,000 meters. Length, not width, mass estimate. Recalibrating this cannot be right. 47 of them, Petra breathed. The bridge had gone very still. Lyra looked at the ships arranged in their perfect patient sphere around her vessel, and she thought about a response that had arrived 17 seconds after it was sent. She thought about 2 warnings delivered honestly in advance, as if courtesy required the announcement of an overwhelming advantage rather than its concealment. She thought about empty space that wasn't empty. Stroud's voice reached her from the tactical console, professional and precise in the way that training produces when everything else has failed. We are surrounded on all vectors. Their current position places them well outside our effective weapons range. Our maximum acceleration would be overtaken within minutes. The formation. He paused. The formation is perfect, he said, and his voice had something in it she had never heard from him before. Not fear exactly. Something more fundamental than fear. The recognition that the world had just demonstrated it was larger than any map he had ever been given. The formation was planned, he said. Before we arrived, they were waiting for us, Hale said quietly. They were already in position when we got here. The communications console activated again. Ren Aldis, still unhurried, still carrying that quality of depth that Lyra was beginning to understand was not a technique. It was simply the tone of someone who had no reason to be anything other than precisely what they were. I apologize for the presentation, Ambassador Voss. We find that certain conversations benefit from a shared understanding of context before they begin. I'm currently aboard the vessel at your 2 o'clock high bearing. May I come aboard? Lyra stood at the viewport for a moment longer. She looked at the 47 ships. She looked at the nothing they had appeared from. She thought about 40 years of negotiation, about 17 speeches she had prepared for scenarios that this was not. Commander Stroud, she said quietly. Tactical assessment. His response came without hesitation in the flat voice of a professional who had stopped performing confidence. We cannot run. We cannot fight. We cannot call for assistance, even if a signal reached Commonwealth Command relief forces would arrive to find nothing they could change. He paused. There is no tactical situation, Ambassador. There is only what we do next. She nodded once. She said into the open channel, Ambassador Aldous, please come aboard. We welcome the conversation. 8 minutes, Aldous replied. Primary docking port. 2 aides all unarmed, as diplomatic convention requires. The channel closed. 8 minutes, Petra said softly. That's not enough time to shuttle from any of those ships. Stroud finished the thought without being asked. She was already close. Before the fleet appeared, before any of it, Lyra moved toward the bridge exit, her hands steady, her mind doing what it had always done when the ground shifted beneath her, moving forward. Find me whatever intelligence we have on human diplomatic protocol, she said. And tell me what I missed. She already knew the answer. She had missed everything. Ren Aldous was shorter than Lyra had expected. That was the first thing she noticed, and she noticed it the way you notice something that contradicts a picture you built in your mind without realizing you were building it. The voice from the communications console had carried such weight, such absolute unhurried certainty, that somewhere in the 8 minutes between the channel closing and the docking port cycling open, Lyra had assembled an image of someone physically imposing. Someone whose body matched the scale of what she had just demonstrated. Instead, the woman who walked through the docking port stood perhaps 1.5 meters tall, with dark auburn hair pulled back from her face in a style that prioritized function. She wore a plain uniform, dark unornamented, the kind of thing designed to be forgotten rather than noticed. Her 2 aides flanked her at a respectful distance, both male, both carrying themselves with the relaxed alertness of people paying close attention while appearing not to. One held a compact data terminal, the other held nothing and watched everything. Nothing about Ren Aldous announced power. That Lyra was already beginning to understand was its own kind of announcement. Aldous performed a slight bow as she crossed the threshold into the reception bay, a gesture the human cultural database had flagged as standard diplomatic respect. Lyra returned it with the triple-hand acknowledgement of Krathian welcome, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other across the neutral space of the bay, each taking the measure of the other with the attention of people whose profession had taught them to look past surfaces. Ambassador Voss Aldous said. Her voice was identical to the transmissions. She was not performing calm. She simply was it. Thank you for receiving us, Lyra said. Ambassador Aldous, your arrival was effective. A slight change moved across Aldous's expression, not quite a smile, something quieter than that. She said we find that certain conversations are better when both parties are working from the same information. May we speak somewhere more comfortable? They processed through the corridor to the diplomatic chamber. Lyra had used this room on 14 previous missions. Circular neutral seating arranged to accommodate different physiologies. A central holographic display table lighting, calibrated to feel neither intimate nor clinical. She had always found it steady, professional. A room that absorbed tension and replaced it with the sense that rational discussion was possible. She noticed as they entered that it felt smaller than it ever had. Her senior staff took their positions. Stroud at the security station near the entrance, his posture carrying the controlled stiffness of a man who had recently revised his threat assessment in a direction he found deeply uncomfortable. Hale at the science console pulling up data with slightly too much focus, the way people concentrate on tasks when they need something to do with their hands. Petra at the cultural liaison station composed but watchful. Aldous and her aides settled into the human-compatible seating with the ease of people who had done this before. The aide with the data terminal placed it on the table and opened it without being asked. The other took a position slightly behind and to Aldous's right and became as nearly as was possible for a living person part of the background. Aldous folded her hands on the table. Ambassador Voss, she said your diplomatic package was exceptional work. 17 linguistic frameworks, cultural sensitivity markers throughout, 3 proposed dates, 4 neutral site suggestions. It demonstrated everything that 40 years of experience produces. Lyra said, and yet you responded with coordinates. Aldous said, and yet we responded with coordinates. She let that sit for a moment. Let me tell you why. The aide with the terminal made a small gesture. The holographic display above the table activated. Lyra looked at what materialized in the air and felt something cold move through her that she did not allow to reach her face. It was the Sovereign Bridge. Not an approximation, not a general schematic of a Veritex-class diplomatic cruiser. It was the Sovereign Bridge, specifically every system, every subsystem, every internal corridor. in power distribution network and weapons array rendered in precise rotating detail. The kind of detail that existed in the ship's own engineering logs and nowhere else. Aldous was said Veritex-class diplomatic cruiser commissioned 18 years ago at the Creus orbital yards. Current crew complement 217. Your primary shield generators have a recurring calibration drift that you compensate by running them at elevated temperature, which costs approximately 11% efficiency. Your propulsion uses a beryllium core plasma drive. Maximum acceleration 7 standard G. Jump capability 8 light years per cycle. She paused. The schematic continued to rotate slowly in the air. Your sensor range is approximately 4 million kilometers for active sweeps, 2 million for passive. Your communications array can encrypt on 12 standard quantum channels. You are currently running on channel 7. Hale made a sound that was not quite a word. Lyra did not look at him. The schematic dissolved. A star map replaced it. The Commonwealth's 17 systems blazed in blue, and across their surface, marked with precision that made Lyra's chest tighten, were details that did not exist in any public record. Fleet positions, orbital defense network coverage maps, population distribution by colony, military installation locations classified at the highest council level for the better part of a decade. The Krathian Commonwealth, Aldous said, commands 17 colonized systems. Total population, 43 billion. Your military consists of 214 capital ships and approximately 1,500 support vessels. Your 6 most populous worlds carry orbital defense networks of varying coverage density. Your most significant strategic vulnerability is a 14-hour response gap between your 3rd and 4th defensive rings in the northern sector, which your fleet planning division has been aware of for approximately 3 years without resolving. Stroud had gone completely still. The display shifted again. Krathian government structure, council composition, factional alignments. And then, with the quality of a door opening onto something Lyra had not expected to find behind it, a detailed breakdown of the current political pressure campaign being run by the expansionist coalition, the one Director Harlan had summarized for her in general terms. The one she had been briefed on as a background factor, managed and contained. The full picture was considerably less contained than the briefing had suggested. Your council is facing significant internal tension, Aldous said. The expansionist coalition controls 7 of 15 senior council seats and has been positioning for a formal policy vote on assertive territorial expansion in the outer sector for the past 8 months. Your mission here was authorized partly as a diplomatic initiative and partly as a political maneuver to demonstrate that engagement was producing results before that vote could be called. Lyra said very quietly how. It was not quite a question. It did not carry the inflection of a question. It was the sound of a word being placed where a longer sentence should have been. Aldous looked at her with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite its absence. Something that occupied the careful space between those things. She said, Ambassador Voss, humanity has been monitoring this sector for 6 standard years. Your civilization, along with 14 other regional powers, has been under continuous observation since we established our border. We know your languages, your cultures, your technologies, your politics, your military doctrines, and your strategic priorities. We have known them with increasing precision for 6 years. The display changed one final time. Lyra recognized the data streams now appearing. They were the Sovereign Bridge's own sensor logs from the journey to these coordinates. Their approach vector, their speed, their internal communications flagged and time-stamped, rendered in perfect Commonwealth notation. We detected your vessel the moment it crossed into proximity of our monitored space, Aldous said. 71 hours ago. We tracked your approach, calculated your arrival window to within a 4-minute margin, and positioned our fleet accordingly. We have been monitoring your internal communications throughout the journey. She paused. We know about the 17 speeches you prepared, Ambassador. We know that Commander Stroud advised against this mission from the initial briefing. We know that Dr. Hale noticed the sensor anomalies in the approach corridor 2 days ago and chose not to escalate his findings. We know that Liaison Vane categorized our second warning as psychologically sophisticated rather than operationally significant. Each person she named reacted. Stroud's jaw tightened fractionally. Hale went still with the particular stillness of someone recognizing in public something they had preferred to keep private. Petra looked at the table. We know, Aldous continued, her voice carrying the same unhurried evenness, throughout that you spent 8 hours refining your opening speech about mutual prosperity and the benefits of cooperation. It is from what we have analyzed a genuinely well-constructed argument, emotionally persuasive, carefully balanced. She looked at Lyra directly. You won't need it today, she said. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when the last piece of familiar ground has been removed from under everyone standing on it. Stroud moved first, not toward the door, not toward any action. He shifted his weight, and then, as if the shift had revealed something, went still again. He said, "You mentioned our internal communications." Aldous said yes. He said our communications are quantum encrypted on rotating channels. Aldous said yes. There was a pause. Stroud said, "At what point during our journey did you begin monitoring them?" Aldous said, "From the moment you crossed the outer boundary marker." "Approximately 68 hours ago." Another pause longer. Stroud said, "I see." He turned back to his station and looked at his console, and the expression on his face was not anger, and it was not defeat. It was the expression of a man completing a calculation that had only one possible answer, and accepting that answer because he was at his core someone who dealt in facts regardless of their comfort. Lyra watched him. In 15 years of working alongside security commanders, she had never seen one arrive at precisely that expression. It was the expression of a man whose entire professional framework had just been handed back to him and shown gently to be a model of something smaller than the real thing. She turned back to Aldous. "She said the coordinates you sent us." Aldous said yes. "She said they weren't an invitation to negotiate." Aldous said no. She said, "What were they?" Aldous unfolded her hands. She leaned back slightly in her chair, and for the first time since entering the room, she looked like someone choosing words rather than simply placing them. "They were a demonstration site," she said. "We brought you to this location, empty space, no natural features, no distractions, because we needed you to see something that your intelligence services would not have discovered through any conventional means available to them. We needed you to see it clearly in person, without the intermediary of secondhand reports or filtered sensor data, because the understanding only holds if the witness is present for it." She gestured to the holographic display which had gone dark. "The fleet," she said, "the 47 vessels surrounding your ship. I need you to understand something about them, Ambassador Voss, because this is the most important piece of information you will carry back to the Commonwealth." She waited a moment, letting what followed land in silence, rather than in the middle of something else. "This," she said, "is not our military." Stroud turned from his console. Hale's hands stopped moving on his keyboard. Petra looked up from the table. Aldous said the 3rd Diplomatic Enforcement Group, 47 Titan-class vessels, each capable of independent stealth operation, each carrying armament sufficient to render a planet's surface permanently uninhabitable. This formation is what humanity deploys to diplomatic engagements when we believe the context requires clarity. It is not our defense fleet. It is not our deterrent force. It is not a significant portion of our military capacity. It is what we assign to conversations. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. Those had been the silence of shock of information arriving faster than it could be processed. This one was quieter, more complete. The silence of a room full of people who had just felt the scale of something shift so far beyond their previous estimates that the estimates themselves had become a different category of object. Not wrong exactly, but irrelevant. The way a map of a single neighborhood is irrelevant when you are trying to understand a continent. Hale said 47 capital ships is the diplomatic attachment. Aldous said yes. Hale said nothing further. He turned back to his console and looked at it with the expression of a man confronting the end of a professional assumption he had not known he was making. Lyra said, "How long were they here before we arrived?" Aldous said the fleet achieved its current formation 43 minutes before your arrival. Every vessel reached its assigned position within a 2-second window. The sensor coordination required to manage that simultaneously across 200,000 kilometers of space. The communication security required to prevent any signal from reaching your passive arrays during approach represents a level of integrated systems capability that your civilization's current developmental trajectory suggests you will reach in approximately 200 years, assuming consistent progress. Lyra said that is a very specific estimate. Aldous has said we have had 6 years to develop our models. And there it was again, the same quality that had been present in every message, every transmission, every word since that first 17-second response. Not arrogance. Arrogance required the possibility of challenge, the awareness of an alternative perspective, the need to assert over something that might push back. This was something else. This was the absolute unperforming certainty of someone simply describing the world as it was the way you describe the temperature of a room or the distance between 2 points. Not because you want to impress anyone, because it is accurate. She said, "Tell me about the technology." Aldous considered this. She said, "I can tell you that it exists and functions as you have observed. The specific mechanisms are not something I am authorized to share at this stage. What I can tell you is that the stealth capability is not a weapon. It is a passive system. The ships were not hidden from you. Specifically, they would be invisible to any sensor technology currently operating in this sector, regardless of the operator or the effort applied. Hale at his console said softly, almost to himself, the energy requirements alone should be detectable. You cannot hide mass. The laws of physics. He stopped. He looked at his readings. He said, you can. Aldous said yes. He was quiet for a long time after that. Buy it up on him. Duh. Then Stroud did something that changed the temperature of the room entirely. He said in the flat professional voice of someone completing a duty rather than making a confession, Ambassador Aldous. At 14:07 and 23 seconds during the early portion of this meeting, I transmitted a quantum encrypted signal on a non-standard channel outside the primary communication array. It was addressed to Commonwealth Fleet Command. It contained our location, our situation assessment, and a request for consultation. He paused. I assume you are already aware of this. I am telling you because I would rather you hear it from me. Aldous looked at him steadily. She said the signal was intercepted 4.2 seconds after transmission. It was decoded within 6 seconds. We have been maintaining a communications suppression envelope at a radius of 2 million kilometers centered on these coordinates since your arrival. No signal of any kind has entered or left that envelope without our awareness. Your message did not reach Commonwealth Command. She paused and then she said something Lyra had not anticipated. She said, Commander Stroud, I want you to understand that what you did was correct. You assessed a situation, determined that your primary responsibility, the safety of this delegation, required outside awareness, and you took the only available action. That you did so without my knowledge, through what you believed was a secure channel, demonstrates exactly the kind of professional integrity that makes diplomatic contact function. I hold no grievance. Stroud looked at her. Something moved across his face through several stages and settled on an expression Lyra did not have a precise name for. The expression of a man who had been treated with a respect he had not anticipated from a direction he had not expected it to come from. He said, thank you. It was the smallest possible version of those two words, and it was the most genuine she had ever heard from him. Aldous had said, there is one more thing I need to show you. She looked at Lyra. She said, my diplomatic transport has been at a distance of approximately 300 meters from your hull since you crossed into our monitored space. It has been there for 68 hours. Commander Stroud, please run a full-spectrum, active sensor sweep, maximum sensitivity of the space 300 meters off your port bow. I am telling you precisely where to look. The exact location. You know it now. Stroud looked at her for one moment. Then he turned to his console and ran the sweep. He ran it twice. He ran it a third time with the sensitivity calibration pushed to its absolute limit, the kind of sweep that would register a person in a pressure suit floating free in open space. He turned back to Aldous. He said nothing. Aldous said yes. He said, you are telling me that a manned vessel has been 300 meters from this hull for 68 hours, through our approach, through 4 hours of waiting, through this entire conversation, and our sensors show nothing. Aldous said, I am. Stroud was quiet. Then, without drama, without performance, he sat down in the nearest chair and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man taking inventory of something that mattered and finding it considerably smaller than he had believed it to be. The room held its silence. Lyra let it hold for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she said, the reason you are telling us all of this. Aldous was said, because you need to go home with the truth, not just a treaty. She said a treaty is a document. It has terms and signatures and legal force. But a treaty negotiated between parties with a false understanding of each other's capabilities is a treaty built on sand. Your council would sign our terms and return to their chambers believing they had conducted a successful negotiation with a promising young civilization minor in scale, manageable in the long term, worth watching carefully. They would make strategic decisions based on that belief. They would allow the expansionist coalition to continue arguing that humanity was a negotiable factor in the sector's balance. They would eventually authorize actions based on a picture of reality that does not exist. She said wars happen, Ambassador Voss, when one side misjudges the other's capabilities, when pride exceeds wisdom, when leaders commit to courses of action based on intelligence that is wrong, not because it was gathered poorly, but because the subject of that intelligence decided what you would know and when you would know it. We have watched 14 civilizations in this sector make exactly that kind of mistake. Several of them paid significant prices. She said, we brought you here to prevent that. Not to humiliate the Commonwealth, not to establish dominance as an end in itself, to show you clearly in person in a way that cannot be softened in a briefing or minimized by distance exactly who you are dealing with, so that when you go home, the decisions your counsel makes will be made from accurate information. She paused. She said the coordinates were not an insult, Ambassador. They were the most direct offer available. Come to where we have prepared for you, see what is true, and then decide what kind of neighbors you want to be. Lyra looked at Aldous across the table, this quiet, unhurried, entirely undemonstrative person who had arrived with 2 aides and no visible weapons and the weight of 47 capital ships and 68 hours of invisible proximity and 6 years of total surveillance behind her, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not fear. Fear she had already processed and set aside. Not awe, though that was present. Something more specific. She felt the shape of 40 years of professional confidence, and she felt what remained of it after this afternoon, and she found that what remained was something cleaner than what had been there before. Smaller, perhaps, but more honest. She said, before I respond to your proposal, there is one thing I want to ask. Aldous said yes. She said, you chose us. Among the 14 civilizations you have been monitoring, you chose the Commonwealth for first contact. I would like to know why. Aldous was quiet for a moment. It was the first pause in her speech that felt like genuine consideration rather than timing. She said, because your civilization is ready for the truth. Your council values stability over expansion at its core, despite its factional pressures. Your analytical frameworks are honest enough to integrate difficult information rather than reject it. And because of you specifically, Ambassador Voss. She said, we analyzed your service record. 23 negotiations, 14 of them in situations where the incoming assessment significantly underestimated the other party's capability. In each of those situations, you adjusted. You did not double down on a false premise. You recalibrated and found a workable outcome. She said we needed someone who could receive what we were going to show them and carry it back intact. Someone who would not round the edges. Someone who wouldn't, out of institutional loyalty or personal embarrassment, give their leadership a softer version of reality than the one they need. She looked at Lyra with the directness of someone who had spent considerable time forming an assessment and was now for the first time delivering it to its subject. She said, we believe you are that person. We hope we are right. The room held its quiet. Outside, 47 ships maintained their perfect formation in the dark, holding a geometry calculated and executed with a precision no instrument on the Sovereign Bridge could fully measure, waiting with the patience of something that had all the time it needed and had decided long ago that patience was worth having. Lyra said, give me 1 hour with my staff. Aldous said, of course. She said it the way a person says something that is simply true, without emphasis, without subtext. And for the first time since those coordinates had appeared on the bridge display 3 days ago, Lyra understood precisely what that meant and what it would mean for everything that came next. The hour Lyra had asked for lasted 53 minutes. She spent the first part of it standing at the viewport of the small briefing room adjacent to the diplomatic chamber, looking at the ships that had revealed themselves, and then settled into a stillness so complete they might have been features of the landscape rather than vessels crewed by living people. The nearest one hung at a distance her mind had stopped trying to convert into meaningful scale. It simply was. Vast, impatient, and without urgency, the way geological things were without urgency. She had spent her career learning to read rooms. She was reading this one now, not the diplomatic chamber, not the 14 faces around the council table waiting for her on Krathia Prime, but the larger room. The one that contained 47 ships and 6 years of silence, and a woman who had spent 11 weeks arguing for the harder path. What she felt was not the absence of the confidence she had carried onto the ship 4 days ago. It was the presence of something that had replaced it. Smaller, perhaps, but more honest, more useful. The kind of confidence that came not from an unbroken record, but from knowing finally the true dimensions of the ground beneath her feet. She straightened. She went to find her staff. They were gathered at the table when she entered, and the atmosphere was the atmosphere of people who had been sitting with difficult things and had arrived through individual calculation at approximately the same place. Hale was at the table with his data terminal, though he was not looking at it. Petra sat with her hands folded, her posture conveying the stillness of someone who had thought carefully and was ready to say what she had concluded. Stroud stood near the wall. He had not sat down again since the diplomatic chamber, and Lyra understood that standing was how he was managing the transition between the man he had been when he boarded this ship and whatever he was in the process of becoming. She sat. She looked at them. She said, I want honest assessments, not what you think I want to hear. Hale went first. He said that from a technical standpoint, the capability gap was not one that closed with time and investment in any framework he could construct. He said that the stealth technology alone represented a theoretical departure from known physics that would require a complete revision of their understanding of mass-energy interaction at the sensor interface. He said he had spent the past 40 minutes running numbers, and every number arrived at the same answer, that humanity's technological baseline was not ahead of theirs in the way that a more advanced civilization was ahead of a less advanced one. It was ahead in the way that a three-dimensional object was ahead of a two-dimensional representation of itself. Different in kind, not merely in degree. He said we should accept whatever terms they offer. We should accept them and be grateful they are offering terms at all. Petra said that from a cultural and diplomatic standpoint, everything Aldous had done since the moment of first contact was consistent with a civilization that genuinely prioritized coexistence over dominance. A civilization seeking subjugation did not warn its targets before demonstrations. It did not explain its reasoning. It did not express respect for its counterparts' professional conduct. The courtesy in Aldous' approach was not a veneer over something else. It was the thing itself, and it was the more remarkable for being delivered from a position of such absolute advantage. She said they are being honest with us because they respect us enough to believe we can handle honesty. I think we should prove them right. Stroud was quiet for a moment after Petra finished. He was looking at the floor with the focused attention of someone consulting an internal document. Then he looked up, and what was on his face was not the security commander's professional composure. It was something rawer than that. Something he had arrived at by setting the composure aside and looking at what was underneath it. He said, I have been building threat assessments for 31 years. I have walked into situations that looked dangerous and found them manageable, and into situations that look manageable and found them dangerous in the skill. The entire skill is in reading the difference accurately. He paused. I misread this one. Not because I was careless. I was operating at the limit of my available information, and I made reasonable inferences. Those inferences were wrong because the information we had was exactly what humanity chose to give us. He said the fleet outside is what they assigned to diplomatic conversations. I have spent the last hour trying to construct a meaningful picture of what they assigned to threats. I cannot do it. The numbers do not hold still long enough to form a picture. He looked at Lyra. He said we accept, not because we have no choice, because this is the only option that preserves the dignity of what we came here to do. Lyra looked at each of them in turn. She said we are agreed then. She said there is one more thing before we return. She told them what she had decided to include in her report to the council. Not the official summary, which would document the treaty and its terms and the successful outcome of the mission in the language that official summaries required. The other report, the one that would be read in closed session by the 15 people who made decisions for 43 billion. She told them what it would say, and she told them why, and she watched their faces as she spoke, and found in those faces the same thing she had found in her own reflection a few minutes before. Clarity, not comfort. Clarity. She said, let's go finish this. Ren Aldous was standing at the viewport of the diplomatic chamber when they returned, looking at the ships outside with an expression Lyra could not fully read. Contemplative, perhaps. The expression of someone looking at a thing they had built and finding it still serviceable. She turned when Lyra entered, and something in her posture recalibrated almost imperceptibly the small adjustment of a person updating an assessment. They sat. The room resettled into its positions. Lyra said, before I give you our answer, there is something I want to ask you. Aldous said yes. Lyra said, you told us what you are capable of. You showed us the fleet, the surveillance, the intercepts. You told us about 6 years of preparation. I believe all of it. What you haven't told us is how close this came to going differently. You chose education over ultimatum. You chose to warn us rather than simply appear. I want to know whether those choices were easy. The room was quiet. Aldous held the question for longer than she had held anything else during this conversation. And in that pause, for the first time since she had walked through the docking port, she looked like someone deciding how much of a true thing to say. She said no. They were not easy. She said 3 months ago, when your team had been preparing your diplomatic package for approximately 6 weeks, we completed our internal review process for this contact. There were 2 primary positions. The first argued for exactly what you have experienced today, an educational approach, full context, honest terms, the demonstration as a foundation for genuine coexistence. The second argued that we should establish our presence, state our requirements, and allow the Commonwealth to respond to the reality of the situation without extended explanation. She said the second position had significant support. It was argued by people I respect, who made reasonable points about efficiency and precedent. They argued that the outcome would be the same regardless of method, and they were probably correct in practical terms. She said I spent 11 weeks arguing against that position. While your team was preparing 17 linguistic frameworks and cultural sensitivity analyses, I was in rooms arguing for spending time and resources on an approach my colleagues considered unnecessarily elaborate. She paused. She said I was not certain I was right until this conversation. Until I watched you sit in this room and receive everything we showed you without collapsing the experience into a simpler story about power and submission. You could have responded to the coordinates with outrage. You could have, when the fleet appeared, attempted to run rather than holding position. You could have heard everything I said and chosen to interpret it as performance rather than honesty. She said you did none of those things. She looked at Lyra. She said I was right to argue for 11 weeks. I was not certain of that until now. Lyra said your 11 weeks mattered, Ambassador Aldous. Aldous said I believe yours did too. A beat of quiet, not the quiet of tension or uncertainty, but the quiet of two people who had arrived from very different directions at the same piece of ground. Then Stroud said without diplomatic softening, and if we refuse. If we decline your terms, return to the Commonwealth, recommend against any treaty. What happens? Aldous looked at him. She said then we remain what we have always been. Neighbors who now have a clear and complete understanding of each other's capabilities. The third diplomatic enforcement group stands down. Our fleet returns to its regular assignments. Our monitoring of Commonwealth space continues at its current level. Stroud said, and then, Aldous has said, and then we wait for your next diplomatic mission. Or the one after that, or the one following. She said it without weight, without emphasis, the way you state a fact about geography. We have been preparing for 6 years already, Commander Stroud. Patience is not a posture we adopt for effect. It is how we operate. We will wait for as long as the Commonwealth needs to be ready for this conversation. We are in no hurry. The room accepted this. Lyra said, we accept your terms, Ambassador Aldous. Aldous said, thank you, Ambassador Voss. The aide brought up the treaty document in the holographic display. Dense with carefully constructed language organized with the precision of something revised many times by people who were very good at their work. Lyra read every clause and every provision. She found what Aldous had told her she would find terms that met or exceeded every objective Director Harlan had authorized her to pursue. Territorial boundaries respecting every existing Krathian colony. Trade frameworks offering genuine exchange. A technology sharing provision limited but real in materials, science, and agricultural systems. A mutual defense clause extending human capability to Commonwealth space against third-party threats. And throughout in every provision, the same fundamental posture: respect for Krathian sovereignty. No requirements to alter governmental structures. No cultural impositions. No subservience dressed as partnership. She signed. Aldous signed. The aides completed the formalities with the efficiency of people who had done this before. And then the diplomatic chamber held a quiet that felt different from all the quiets that had preceded it. Less like the absence of something and more like the presence of something new. Something that had not existed an hour ago and would outlast every person in the room. Aldous said, we have already transmitted the full documentation to Commonwealth Command on your behalf. Lyra said, when? Aldous said, approximately 7 minutes ago. Lyra considered this. The treaty had reached her government before it was signed in this room. They had transmitted it 7 minutes ago, which meant they had been certain of the outcome before it had technically occurred. She did not find this alarming. She found it honest. Of course they knew. The courtesy was in the ceremony anyway, in the acknowledgement that the moment of agreement mattered, even when the conclusion had been visible from a considerable distance. She said, we are ready to depart when you are prepared to receive us. Aldous said, the fleet will escort you to the boundary of human claimed space. Not because we have any concern about your intentions, but because we would prefer that no other vessel in this sector misinterpret your presence here without context. Stroud at his station said quietly, they are going to escort us home with a battle fleet. Lyra said, that's not the message for us, Kyle. She had not used his first name before, not once in 15 years, and she saw him register it. She said, it's the message for everyone watching. This is what happens when you engage with humanity honestly. You receive what you came for, and they protect you while you leave. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what's the message they're not saying aloud? She looked at the ships beginning their repositioning outside 47 vessels, shifting with mathematical grace into the geometry of a corridor or extending toward the boundary of human space. She said, if this is what they assign to diplomatic missions, imagine what they assign to threats. He held that thought. Then he nodded once with the slow finality of a man completing a very long calculation. The journey back took 14 hours. Lyra spent the first several of them writing. Not the official report, the other one. The one she had described to her staff. The one that would go to the council in closed session, encrypted at the highest available level, marked for Director Harlan's personal review before any distribution. She wrote it in plain language. No diplomatic framing, no institutional softening, just the sequence of events and what they meant rendered as accurately as she could for an audience that had not been in the room. She wrote every strategic assessment we have made about this sector was wrong. Not incomplete, not slightly inaccurate, fundamentally comprehensively wrong, not because our analysts worked poorly, but because the subject of those analyses decided what we would know. She wrote, "We are not returning with a negotiated treaty. We are returning with terms that were offered to us by a civilization that had already determined what it wanted and what it was willing to give and chose to offer those terms because it preferred neighbors who understood reality over neighbors who had to be corrected by force. The distinction matters, and the council must hold it clearly in mind." She wrote, "Humanity is not a pure power managing its position in a regional balance. It is not a minor civilization worth watching carefully while we consolidate our own position. It is the balance. Any strategy built on the assumption that humanity is negotiable, testable, or manageable in the ways we have historically managed regional relationships will fail not through military defeat, but through the more fundamental failure of operating on a false picture of what is real." She wrote, "They have chosen peace. We should be grateful for that choice every day, and we should never under any circumstances give them reason to reconsider it." She read it over once, changed nothing, and sent it. Hale appeared at the door of her quarters in the 11th hour. He said he had been running the stealth calculations since the fleet disappeared. He said the 200-year estimate Aldous had given was being generous. The physics required did not represent advancement along a line they were already on. It represented a departure point they had not reached and had not yet theorized. He paused. "It doesn't change anything about what we're doing," he said. "You can't navigate a gap you can't measure. You can only decide what kind of relationship you want with the thing on the other side of it." She said, "What kind do you want?" He said, "An honest one." "Whatever else?" "An honest one." She said, "I think so too." He left. She returned to the viewport. Outside, the 47 ships paced the Sovereign Bridge with the unhurried precision that had characterized every human action since the first 17-second response. Enormous and silent and without urgency, and somewhere among them at a distance that could not be detected by any instrument aboard this ship, a small diplomatic transport was keeping pace in its perfect invisibility, the way it had kept pace for nearly 4 days, without once revealing itself until it chose to. She thought about what it meant to spend 6 years learning the shape of your neighbors before speaking a single word to them. That kind of patience was not a tactic. It was a value. A decision made at some foundational level about what kind of power was worth having and what kind of peace was worth building. The boundary of human claimed space appeared on the navigation display as a mathematical notation, the same kind of clean coordinate system that had started all of this. No physical marker, no beacon or buoy or visible line, just numbers defining a threshold. Humanity's border drawn in mathematics, the way everything they did seemed to be drawn, precise and ambiguous, requiring no decoration to be real. As the Sovereign Bridge approached it, the 47 ships began to decelerate. They repositioned with the smooth coordination Lyra had stopped finding surprising, and had begun finding simply characteristic, forming a wall behind the Sovereign Bridge at the boundary, dark and still and present. One final transmission, Aldous' voice, the same measured quality, and beneath it something warmer than had been present in the diplomatic chamber, though no less precise. "Ambassador Voss, you are approaching the boundary of human claimed space. The treaty is in effect as of this moment, documentation transmitted and confirmed received by Commonwealth Command." She paused. "Your private report, the unofficial communication you drafted 4 hours and 17 minutes ago. I want you to know that it will serve your people well. The truth is a difficult thing to carry intact through institutions that prefer comfortable simplifications. You carried it intact. That required something that technical skill alone does not provide." Lyra activated her channel. She said, "We will honor this treaty, Ambassador Aldous. Not because of the fleet behind me, though I won't insult your intelligence by pretending it is irrelevant, because you showed us that strength and decency can occupy the same position simultaneously, and because that is worth honoring for its own sake." She said, "You spent 11 weeks arguing for the harder path. The Commonwealth will spend the next generation learning why that mattered. I will make certain of it." A pause. Aldous said, I believe you. Safe travels, Ambassador Voss. May your words reach your leaders clearly, and may they be heard for what they are. She said, until we speak again. Aldous all said, until then. The channel closed. The Sovereign Bridge crossed the boundary. Behind it, the 47 ships held their formation for a moment, that wall of scale dark against the stars, maintaining the geometry of their corridor with the same perfection they had maintained everything else. Then one by one they ceased to be visible, not departing, not burning drives and pulling away, simply returning to the invisible state that was their natural condition, stepping back into the quantum quiet from which they had emerged at a moment of their own choosing. Within 90 seconds, the viewport showed empty space. Hale's console showed empty space. Every instrument aboard the Sovereign Bridge showed empty space. She said, they're still out there. Stroud said yes. Petra said, all of them. Lyra looked at the empty space that was not empty, and she thought about a civilization that had spent 6 years learning the shape of its neighbors before speaking a single word to them. She said, until they decide otherwise. The Sovereign Bridge accelerated toward home. Somewhere behind them, invisible and certain 47 ships maintained their vigil at the line humanity had drawn in mathematics, not threatening, not waiting for anything to go wrong, simply present in the way that a promise is present even when it cannot be seen. Lyra did not look back. She did not need to. Director Harlan received Ambassador Voss in closed council session 6 days later. She stood at the head of the long table where less than 4 months ago she had looked at 5 pale systems on a holographic map and felt the familiar sharpening of professional attention. The map was still there. The 5 systems still burned in their quiet white. 17 blue systems surrounded them. She did not look at the map. She looked at the 15 faces around the table, at Harlan's flat hands and the Expansionist Coalition's representative with his carefully neutral expression, at the advisors and the analysts and the people whose decisions shaped the lives of 43 billion people who would never sit in this room. She said, the treaty is excellent. Its terms meet and exceed every authorized objective. I recommend ratification without modification. She said, I also recommend that every person in this room read the unofficial communication I transmitted before anything else, before the strategy sessions, before the advisory briefings, before the political calculations about how to present this outcome to the public. Harlan said, your language in that communication was stark. She said, yes. He said, the council will want context. She said, the communication is the context. She looked at him steadily. She said, Director, the Commonwealth did not negotiate a treaty this week. We were offered one by a civilization that had determined its terms 6 years before we sent our first message and chose to offer them because it preferred neighbors who understood reality over neighbors who would eventually have to be corrected by other means. The treaty is real and should be honored, absolutely. But the Council must understand that honoring it is not a diplomatic strategy. It is the only rational response to an accurate understanding of what is true. Harlan said, you believe humanity poses no threat to the Commonwealth. She said, I believe humanity poses an existential opportunity. The threat is not humanity. The threat is our capacity to misunderstand what they have offered and why. She said they could have presented themselves as conquerors. They have every instrument required for it. Instead, they chose to be neighbors, and they chose that carefully over significant internal opposition because they believed it was the right way to build something that would hold. That is a gift. The only way we lose it is by failing to recognize it for what it is. The chamber held its quiet. Harlan's hands were flat on the table. He had read the unofficial report. He had already decided. The session was the formality that confirmed what the report had already accomplished, and they both knew it. The Expansionist Coalition's representative opened his mouth once and then closed it. The numbers in Lyra's unofficial report were very specific, and specific numbers had a way of closing certain arguments before they could fully form. The Council ratified the treaty. 18 months after the Sovereign Bridge returned to Krathian space, Ambassador Lyra Voss sat in a reception hall aboard a neutral station in the outer sector and watched 7 civilizations attempt the careful, slightly overcautious work of people who had recently revised their understanding of the universe. The Velhari hierarchy had signed 8 weeks after the Commonwealth, the Syndicate worlds 3 weeks after that. 5 others in the months between each contacted in the same way, each brought to coordinates that appeared empty, each returning changed in ways their official diplomatic summaries did not fully capture, but their subsequent behavior made unmistakably clear. The expansionist factions in 3 of those civilizations had gone very quiet after the contact reports came back. Wars that had been in preliminary planning stages had been quietly deferred. Border provocations that had seemed inevitable had not materialized. The sector was not peaceful. It had never been peaceful. But it was in some way it had not previously been honest, and honesty Lyra had come to believe was the precondition for everything else worth having. Aldous was across the room, speaking with a delegation Lyra didn't recognize. She moved through the gathering with the same quality she had carried into the Sovereign Bridge's docking bay 14 months ago, unhurried, entirely present, carrying nothing visible and everything necessary. She saw Lyra and crossed the room. They stood together for a moment without speaking, watching the seven civilizations work at the difficult project of finding common ground when the ground had recently shifted under all of them. Aldous said your council ratified without modification. Lyra said they did. Aldous said the expansionist vote failed 3 months ago. 9 votes. She paused. That margin doesn't happen without accurate information reaching the right people at the right time. Lyra said you're welcome. Aldous looked at her. The slight change in expression that Lyra had first seen in the docking bay was present again, the one that meant something genuine was close to the surface. She said your unofficial report. I want you to know that I read it 4 hours and 17 minutes after you transmitted it before you had crossed back into Commonwealth space. Lyra said of course you did. Aldous said it was honest in a way that institutional documents rarely are. Most ambassadors in your position would have softened the account, not out of dishonesty, but out of the reasonable desire to protect their credibility, to be believed rather than dismissed as someone who had been overwhelmed. You gave your counsel the unfiltered version. That is harder than it sounds. Lyra said you gave me the unfiltered version first. It seemed appropriate to pass it along. Aldous considered this. Then she raised her glass in the human gesture Lyra had studied in the cultural database months ago, and now recognized as genuine rather than ceremonial. She said to difficult truths. Lyra returned the gesture. She said, and to the people who choose them anyway. They drank. Outside the station's viewport, the stars held their positions in the patient dark. The same stars they had always been, indifferent and permanent, entirely unchanged by the fact that somewhere among them, invisible certain present ships maintained their vigil as they always had and always would. Not as a threat, not as a demonstration of anything that still needed demonstrating. Simply as a fact of the universe, the way gravity was a fact, the way the speed of light was a fact, something you could measure the rest of your decisions against and trust to hold. Lyra finished her drink. She looked at the 7 civilizations around the room, at the careful gestures and cautious proposals and slowly relaxing postures of people learning to work from a shared understanding of what was real. And she thought about what Aldous had said 14 months ago in the diplomatic chamber of the Sovereign Bridge. Peace requires foundation, not promises, not good intentions expressed in well-crafted diplomatic language. Foundation. A shared and accurate understanding of what is true, arrived at honestly and held without flinching, even when what is true is uncomfortable, even when it is smaller than what you hoped, even when it requires you to revise the picture of the world you have been carrying for a very long time. The coordinates had been the beginning of that foundation. Not because they were clever, not because they were intimidating, but because they were honest. The first honest thing in a conversation that required honesty to exist at all. Come, they had said, see, understand, and then decide. She thought this is what they intended all along. Not the fleet, not the reveal, not the careful dismantling of every assumption the Krathian Commonwealth had brought into that empty sector of space. All of that had been the method. The intention had always been this. These rooms, these careful conversations, these 7 civilizations building something from accurate information instead of comfortable fiction. There was still work to do. There would always be more work. The sector was large, and its civilizations were complicated, and the peace being built was the kind that required daily maintenance rather than the kind that could be declared and left to run on its own. But it was being built from honest ground. Aldous set down her glass and turned back toward the reception, moving through the room with the same unhurried quality that Lyra had stopped finding unnerving and had come to find simply true, the natural condition of someone who had prepared thoroughly, acted carefully, and built something meant to last. Lyra watched her go. Then she straightened in the way she had straightened in the briefing room of the Sovereign Bridge before going to finish what she had come to start, and she walked back into the gathering. There were neighbors to meet, there was work to do, and the stars outside held their patient positions in the dark, watching as they always had, as they always would, as long as there were things worth watching over.